The calendar invite popped up in my inbox at exactly 9 in the morning, carrying a subject line that made my stomach churn: Vision Alignment Session. In my 20 years of working in federal compliance, I had learned that such phrasing was nothing more than corporate shorthand for impending disaster. The coffee in the break room was still hot, and my desk was stacked with folders, but the quiet of the morning was shattered when Trent Ridley walked in. He moved through the carpeted hallways with the unearned confidence of someone who had never known the fear of a performance review. Trent was 28 years old, the son of our company founder, and he carried himself like he owned the building. In a way, he did, or at least he would when his father fully retired. His handshake was limp and damp, like holding a piece of uncooked poultry, but he smiled as if he was doing everyone a favor just by existing. I had dedicated 2 decades of my life to Ridley Defense Solutions. I had guided the firm through 3 major acquisitions, budget crises, and countless audits. I was the one who spent late nights translating complex federal procurement guidelines into steps that our engineers could actually follow. While other departments spent their budgets on fancy retreats, I was in the archives printing regulatory manuals and tracking certification forms. My compliance record was spotless. There were no warnings, no flags, and no unresolved findings. I was the person who understood the intricate details of the Defense Contract Audit Agency guidelines. I knew the regulations better than I knew my own family history. I had spent years building a system that kept us safe from federal penalties. I remembered my typical interactions with the federal auditors. They were strict, calculating, and checked the credentials of the primary officer before they even opened a folder. My name was registered in the secure federal database, which was a badge of honor for me. I also knew every sound in this building, from the hum of the lobby printer to the exact sound the break room coffee maker made when brewing. It was my second home, and I had protected it with precision. So, when Trent clicked to his first slide during our leadership meeting and announced that he was going to automate our compliance workflow, I had to suppress a laugh. He talked about replacing manual verification with software, using a smug tone that suggested he had discovered a new continent. He looked at me and said that no offense was intended, but my methods were simply too old-fashioned for the modern era. It was like telling a heart surgeon that his skills were no longer needed because we had a new automated checklist. He kept talking about velocity and efficiency, showing slides with charts that had no actual data. He claimed that the company could save 60% on compliance overhead by removing manual review processes. I did not argue, I did not complain. I simply sat with my hands clasped on the table and asked if this change represented a formal modification of my employment terms. The human resources manager looked at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. She stammered that it was just a transitional phase, a way to find efficiencies in our operations. Within 72 hours, my office had been cleaned out. A new analyst named Toby had moved his belongings into my space, and I was assigned to the reception desk in the front lobby. Trent gave me a wink when he saw me sitting there, claiming that the front desk was a critical role because first impressions were everything to our clients. I did not raise my voice. I smiled, nodded, and quietly printed a copy of my original employment contract, placing it in my leather folio. I watched the daily operations from my new post, sitting behind the marble counter like an observer in a quiet theater. The interns looked at me with pity, and the junior staff whispered as they walked by, but I remained still. Trent replaced our experienced regulatory attorney with a college classmate named Brody, a young lawyer who talked about regulations as if they were suggestions rather than law. All the while, I kept my compliance journals up to date, not because I wanted to help Trent, but because I knew the federal review was approaching. I knew the regulations better than anyone else in the building, and my name was still listed on the official registry as the primary officer. You cannot simply delete 20 years of authority with a single email and a smile. Every morning, I arrived at the office at precisely 7 o'clock. I brewed the first pot of coffee, sorted the mail, and sat at the marble reception desk. From this position, I had a perfect view of the entire lobby. I watched the new team members arrive, clutching their leather bags and looking very busy. They had no idea that compliance was not about looking busy. It was about precision. It was about knowing every detail of the federal acquisition regulations. I watched Trent walk through the lobby, holding a tablet and talking loudly on his phone. He looked at me and smiled, but it was a cold, empty smile. He thought he had won. He thought he had pushed me out of the way, but he did not realize that I was simply waiting. I was seasoned like a cast-iron skillet, and the heat was just beginning to rise. I knew that the federal auditors would not care about Trent's slides or his automated workflows. They would care about the facts, and the facts were in my notebook. From my vantage point at the lobby desk, I watched the slow erosion of the systems I had spent 20 years building. The new compliance team, which Trent had renamed the Innovation Hub, was a constant source of amusement. They set up whiteboards covered in diagrams about risk management, but they could not answer basic questions about procurement rules. I watched them scramble to prepare documents, their hands shaking as they tried to organize folders for the upcoming review. They had no understanding of the federal rules, and they treated the contract files as if they were simple spreadsheets. Meanwhile, a critical deadline was approaching. The primary federal agreement, Contract 52B89E, valued at $450 million, was due for its annual renewal. Under the federal rules, the contract required a certified procurement officer to sign off on all compliance updates. If the primary officer did not hold an active certification, the agreement would face immediate suspension upon audit. This specific contract had been the result of a bidding process that took 2 years, involving over 3,000 pages of technical specifications, and it represented the primary source of revenue for our manufacturing division. It was signed years ago by Trent Ridley and a high-ranking defense official. Losing it would destroy the company. My own certification was set to expire in 25 days. My former assistant, Sarah Jenkins, who had been reassigned to work under Brody, was supposed to handle the renewal paperwork. But she was overwhelmed with Trent's new formatting templates and forgot the deadline. I saw the automatic reminder email land in my inbox. I looked at the link that would allow me to renew the certification in less than a minute. Then I looked across the lobby at Trent, who was explaining his automation strategy to a group of expensive consultants. For the first time in 20 years, I did not click the link. I closed the browser tab and went back to organizing the visitor log. I knew that if I did not renew the certification, the company would be in breach of the contract terms. But I also knew that Trent had stripped me of my authority, so it was no longer my responsibility to save him from his own incompetence. One afternoon, Brody walked into the lobby, talking loudly to a junior analyst. He was explaining that the federal acquisition regulations were just a set of suggestions. He claimed that the team could automate the entire process with a simple script, and that they did not need to spend time on manual reviews. I sat behind my desk, listening to his words, and felt my decision to remain silent harden. I knew that the federal database would not accept a script in place of a certified officer. But Brody was too confident to check the rules. He looked at me as he walked past, giving me a dismissive nod. He thought I was just a receptionist, an old man who did not understand the modern business world. A few days later, Trent called me into a glass conference room for what he termed a role adjustment discussion. He sat across from me and smiled, lacing his fingers together as he spoke. He told me that my tenure was appreciated, but the company was moving toward a faster model. He explained that my role was being permanently shifted to the front desk, where I would serve as a client relations representative. He claimed that 80% of compliance tasks could now be managed by software, rendering my old role unnecessary. He waved his hand dismissively when I mentioned my certifications, saying that they were just letters on a page, and that the new system did not require them. I listened to him speak, noting the casual way he dismissed 20 years of experience. I did not flinch. I told him that I would need the new duties and reporting structure provided to me in writing before I could accept them. Trent's smile faded for a second, and he muttered that human resources would provide the paperwork. I nodded and told him I would wait for the formal documentation. I knew that Trent hated putting things in writing, as paper trails made him nervous. But I was a compliance officer, and my entire career was built on documentation. No paperwork arrived that week. Instead, my digital permissions began to disappear. I was locked out of the federal portal, and my access to the internal compliance files was revoked. The new team was now completely in charge of the $450 million contract, and they were making mistakes that made me shudder. I wrote down every error in my personal notebook. Documenting the date and time of each infraction, the interns continued to run through the lobby with binders, completely unaware that the foundation of their project was crumbling. They would stop by my desk to ask questions about the old filing system, and I would point them toward the storage room. I did not offer any advice. I did not point out their mistakes. I simply watched and recorded. I watched Brody draft a memo that confused a subcontractor clearance with a vendor invoice. I saw Toby upload an unsigned agreement to the Federal Registry. Every mistake they made was a new entry in my notebook. I knew that the federal audit was scheduled for the end of the month, and the timeline was fixed. There was no way for them to recover from these errors without my help, but they were too arrogant to ask. Trent continued to boast about his cost savings, unaware that he was standing on a trap of his own making. The office had transformed into a showcase of superficial metrics. The consultants Trent hired spent their days creating color-coded slides and talking about compliance culture, while the actual regulatory files were in complete disarray. I sat at the front desk and watched junior analysts struggle to complete basic vendor screenings. One afternoon, a young engineer stopped by the counter and whispered that the new team did not even know how to verify subcontractor credentials. I simply smiled and handed him a visitor badge. They had forgotten that I still possessed my login credentials for the Federal Registry, as my profile had not been removed from the government system. Officially, I was still the primary officer of record for Contract 52B89E. I logged into the government portal from my desk using a secure connection and checked the status. My certification was now only 12 days away from expiration, and the system showed a warning flag that no one else in the office could see. The pressure was beginning to show on the new team. Sarah Jenkins looked pale as she tried to answer Brody's questions about the renewal filings. I overheard them discussing the signatures required for the upsung submission. Brody suggested that they could simply use my signature from a previous document to complete the digital submission, since I was still listed as the active officer. Trent was copied on the email chain and responded that they should do whatever was necessary to get the filing submitted. I printed the email thread and placed it in my folder. They were planning to forge my signature on a federal compliance document, which was a clear violation of California Penal Code, Section 470. They had no idea that I was reading their messages, nor did they realize the legal implications of their actions. They were so focused on meeting their internal deadlines that they were willing to commit forgery. They believed that because the submission was digital, no one would check the signature. They thought that my name was just a placeholder, a detail that could be manipulated to suit their needs. But they did not understand that the Federal Registry compared digital signatures with active credentials. If they uploaded a document with my forged signature, it would trigger an automatic investigation. I watched them work from my desk, their faces lit by the glow of their screens, and felt a cold sense of satisfaction. They were building their own prison, and they were inviting me to watch the construction. They would drink their green tea and expensive coffees, complaining about the software dashboard being completely broken. They were throwing error codes like access denied because the defense database only allowed connection from authorized IP addresses. They spent hours trying to troubleshoot the system, completely unaware that their problems were just beginning. Brody's email message had contained a small disclaimer at the bottom stating that the discussion was for internal administrative review only. It was a clear attempt to shield himself from the legal consequences of his plan, showing that he knew it was wrong. I printed the email chain in triplicate. I locked one copy in my reception desk drawer, placed one copy in my briefcase, and kept one at home in my personal safe. I felt the comforting weight of my briefcase in my hand as I walked out of the building. A few nights later, as I was preparing to leave the office, the phone on the reception desk rang. It was Edward Ridley, the company founder. He was calling from his winter home, and his voice sounded tired and concerned. He asked me if the preparation for the renewal of contract 52B89E was on schedule. He said he had seen a system alert from the federal agency and wanted to ensure everything was in order. He spoke of the early days of the company when we worked out of a small, rented office and double-checked every document by hand. He reminded me that integrity was the foundation of our success. I told him that I was no longer managing the compliance department, as Trent had reassigned me to the front desk. Edward was silent for a long moment. He asked how that was possible, given that my name was still on the federal filing. I explained that while I was still the officer of record, I had no authority to manage the files and my system access had been revoked. I told him that he would need to speak with Trent about the status of the renewal. He thanked me and hung up, his voice filled with worry. I locked my desk drawer, placed my keys in my pocket, and walked out into the cool evening air. I spent the weekend walking through the park, thinking about the 20 years I had given to the company. I remembered when Edward first hired me, and how we had built the compliance system from the ground up. We had worked together to ensure that every contract was perfect and that the company always acted with integrity. Now Trent was destroying that reputation in a matter of weeks. But I did not feel any regret. I knew that I had done my job and that I had warned them of the risks. If they chose to ignore my warnings and violate the law, they would have to face the consequences. I was no longer responsible for their survival. I was just an observer, waiting for the final act of the play. The day before the federal review arrived, and the office was filled with a tense silence. The consultants had stopped laughing, and the compliance team was huddled in the main conference room. The truth had finally caught up with them. Kelly, a paralegal who was reviewing the filing portal, realized that my procurement certification had expired at midnight. The federal database had automatically updated my status to inactive, which triggered an immediate flag on the renewal application for contract 52B89E. The system was locked and the deadline was less than 24 hours away. The human resources manager, Melissa, came down to the lobby with a look of desperation on her face. She asked me to step into the conference room with her, her voice trembling slightly. I followed her into the room, where Brody and Toby were waiting. The table was covered in binders, and Toby looked like he was about to collapse from exhaustion. Melissa sat across from me and smiled, her tone pleading. She told me that there had been a misunderstanding regarding my role, and they needed my help to resolve a small technical issue. She asked if I would log into the portal and renew my certification immediately, claiming that the company would cover the fees and provide a bonus for my assistance. Melissa added that Trent was willing to raise my salary by 30% and give me my old office back if I helped them resolve this matter today. She tried to appeal to my loyalty, talking about how the company had been like a family to me and how my retirement package would be affected if the firm went under. I looked at the three of them and shook my head. I told them that 30% was not enough to cover the risk of signing forged federal documents. That was a criminal offense under federal procurement guidelines. I explained that I would not put my career at risk for a company that does not respect the regulations. I pointed out that a retirement package was completely worthless if the company was indicted for federal fraud and forgery under California Penal Code. Section 470. I also mentioned that by reassigning me and laying off other staff without proper notice, they had violated the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, specifically Title 29 of the United States Code Section 2101, which already put the company in jeopardy of class action lawsuits from the former employees. I told them that I was no longer the compliance officer, as I had been reassigned to receptionist duties. I reminded them that my system access had been revoked and that I was no longer authorized to act on behalf of the company for federal filings. Brody tried to argue, claiming that there was no formal documentation of a demotion, so I was still technically the active officer. He suggested that I had a duty to the company as an employee, and that my refusal could be seen as insubordination. I pulled out my copies of the internal emails from Trent and the Human Resources Department, which clearly stated, that my duties had been reassigned to the new team. I looked Brody in the eye and explained that they could not strip me of my authority, lock me out of the portal, and then demand that I sign federal documents. I explained that submitting a renewal under my name when I had been stripped of my authority would constitute a breach of fiduciary duty and a violation of federal regulations. I told them that any attempt to use my credentials without authorization would render the entire filing void ab initio. Kelly looked at Brody, her face pale as she realized the legal reality of the situation. They knew that if they attempted to forge my signature, they would face severe legal penalties. Toby was visibly sweating, explaining how Trent had pressured him to complete the filing, saying it was just a simple click and that nobody would ever audit the details. Toby admitted he was terrified of the legal consequences and had almost resigned the previous week. The realization that they had no options left was visible on their faces. I stood up, collected my papers, and told them that I had to return to the front desk. I left them in the conference room, surrounded by useless binders and the sudden realization that their project was ruined. They stayed in that room for hours, trying to find a way to bypass the system. I heard their voices rising through the glass walls, arguing about who was responsible for the oversight. Trent arrived later in the afternoon, looking flustered and angry. He stormed into the room and closed the door, but I could still hear the tension. They knew that without my active certification, the renewal was impossible. They had tried to replace me with software and junior staff, but they had failed to understand that the federal system required a certified officer. I sat at my desk, answering phone calls and directing visitors, feeling a quiet sense of peace. I had done my duty, and I had documented everything. The trap was about to close, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The morning of the audit was clear and cold. I arrived early and took my seat at the reception desk wearing my dark blue blazer. The lobby was quiet, but the air was thick with tension. The federal auditor, Harvey Vance, arrived at 9 o'clock. He was a seasoned inspector who had conducted 3 of our previous reviews. He looked at me behind the counter, his eyebrows rising in surprise. He asked why I was sitting at the reception desk. He wanted to know if everything was all right, noting that my name was missing from the executive organizational chart. I replied calmly that I was handling external relations now. Harvey looked at me with a knowing expression and said that we would see what the Federal Registry had to say. He did not press for more details. I handed him his visitor badge and directed him to the executive conference room upstairs. Trent and Brody were waiting for him, clutching their slides and pretending that everything was under control. I remained at my desk, sipping my coffee and watching the clock. 20 minutes later, the silence upstairs was broken by the sound of doors opening. I heard hurried footsteps in the hallway. Toby ran down the stairs, his face white, and disappeared into the Human Resources office. Slower footsteps followed, and I saw Harvey Vance walk out of the elevator, holding his folder. He was followed by Trent, whose face had lost all its color, and Brody, who looked completely stunned. They walked into the main lobby, and Harvey stopped at my desk. He looked at me and said that the review was complete. He explained that since the primary officer of record did not hold an active certification, and because the company had attempted to submit an unauthorized filing, the renewal for contract 52B89E was rejected. Under federal law, the $450 million contract was suspended, effective immediately. He told Trent that the signature on the portal did not match the records on file, and that the submission appeared to be forged. He stated that under California Penal Code Section 470, forgery on an official filing made the entire renewal void ab initio. The gravity of the situation was clear to everyone in the lobby. Trent tried to speak, his voice high and nervous, claiming that it was an administrative oversight that could be fixed in a few hours. But Harvey Vance simply shook his head and said that the federal database was locked and that an investigation would be launched. He walked out of the building, leaving Trent standing in the center of the lobby. I stood up, opened my folio, and handed Trent my formal resignation letter. I told him that I had retained copies of all internal communications regarding my removal and the revocation of my system access. I added that if the legal department wished to discuss the timeline of the events, they could contact me through a formal subpoena. I walked out of the lobby, leaving the company behind. As I walked through the parking lot, I saw the security guards talking in hushed tones about the arrival of federal investigators. I felt the heavy weight of the keys in my hand, and I threw them into the recycling bin near the exit door. I drove home, watching the city skyline in my rearview mirror. The rain started to fall, washing away the tension of the last few months. I felt a deep sense of relief as I realized that I would never have to return to that office. I hung my navy blue blazer in the closet, knowing I had worn it for the last time. By that evening, the company systems were shut down, and the federal suspension was official. I sat in a quiet tavern down the street, enjoying a glass of bourbon. My phone was already buzzing with messages from competitors who had heard about the audit. I smiled and set the phone down. I did not need to run a scheme. I had simply let the rules do their work. The tavern was warm, and the sound of the rain outside was soothing. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the warmth settle in my chest. For 20 years, I had carried the burden of the company's compliance, always worrying about the next audit, the next regulation, the next deadline. Now that burden was gone, transferred back to the people who had tried to cast me aside. I looked at my phone, which continued to light up with notifications. Recruiters were calling, offering me positions with higher salaries and more respect. One offer was for a vice president of compliance position at a major defense firm, offering twice my old salary. I knew that I would take one of those offers eventually, but not tonight. Tonight, I was content to sit in the quiet tavern, listening to the rain and enjoying the silence. I had built a career on precision and documentation, and in the end, it was that very precision that had set me free. Trent and his team had thought they could replace experience with automation. But they had learned that the federal government does not accept slides as compliance. They had built their house on sand, and I had simply watched the tide come in.